The Journey of Square Peg, Chapter 4, The Option. When I first started thinking about what I would do if the oil finally ran out, it was an amusing exercise. I was caught up in a craze that swept the nation with the popularity of a TV drama series. It was common for fans of this show in particular to discuss what they would do in the event of a zombie apocalypse and the breakdown of society. Perhaps the craze was also fueled by our shared experience of the effects of a global pandemic and what had resulted from months of economic inactivity. I was always a fan of zombie movies. They were a guilty pleasure. I used to wonder what I would do if the apocalypse came about for real, and what would be the rules by which we survived. Most people concentrated on killing zombies with machine guns. No one ever seemed to think about the real threats that could arise. In those zombie movies, the bad guys tend to be a bit slow moving, unarmed, thick, but that was a luxury by comparison with what our fellow man could do to us if motivated by hunger and a grab for power. You'd face an enemy for whom cunning, ingenuity, and the ability to be evil are practically part of their DNA. A person with instincts honed by thousands of years, represented as ruthless a predator as one could hope not to face in a world without rules. A human, determined and free to further their own interests, was far more dangerous to the prospect than a staggering, slathering zombie could ever be. And war atrocities proved that they were crueler too. There would be no burning people in cages, flaying alive, no public beheadings to kowtow the frightened masses in a zombie apocalypse. In movies, zombies just bite what they see. In real life, people willfully hunt, lay traps, move fast, develop means, solve problems, and kill without remorse, even finding justification for this behaviour as they dehumanize the victims in their fervour. As a paramedic, I've been no stranger to the cruelty of act and fate that human actions and frailties could visit upon the unprepared or the unlucky. I considered myself worldly in the ways in which a person could die. My beliefs about mankind and experience of seeing it at its worst had made me something of a superstitious person. I knew just how easily fate could determine that I would not return, and that is why I never left home without telling my children I loved them and I was proud of them. Superstition and omen meant something to me. Perhaps it was because I have witnessed many unusual things both in my adult working life and when I was younger. Thinking back as I write this now, I can identify a key experience that perhaps played out in the events of recent years, thus cementing my habitual expectation of disaster. Working as a teenager, cleaning a classic car for a wealthy neighbour, I was listening to some random music radio station. At some point, the lady of the house brought me a rich, dark filter coffee in a small cup on a pewter tray. She asked me what I was listening to, murmured about the pleasing effect of my work on the vehicle, and then said softly, "I know a carpenter who listens to that station all day, every day." Her American drawl had been softened by years of it in England. She was an attractive woman, probably of the cheerleading set in her own youth. Can you imagine what he would know if he had spent all that time listening to BBC Radio 4? Anyway, she added idly, "When you've finished, I'd like you to rub some linseed oil into something for me." I threw down the rag immediately at this suggestion. Doubtless my eyes had a sparkle to them too. Ignoring my vigour, she led me towards a small stone shed set into the wall of the enclosed cottage garden. Piqued and unfamiliar with linseed oil, I followed her, wondering what this could possibly lead to, trying not to react to the image building in my head, only to reach the shed and be handed a richly textured, darkly coloured wooden object, about the size of a watermelon. A wisp of disappointment fleeted through me as I feigned interest in it. The strange object was thickly rounded at one end and tapered to a point at the other, kind of egg-shaped, with a small hatch seamlessly integrated in the slatted wood on the upper surface. It felt solid, odd, and otherworldly. She handed me the equipment and left me with the project, promising to return. I took the rag and began to apply the oil to the smooth fins of the hardwood that colluded to form its shape. Before long, curiosity drove me to open the hatch. Within, beyond all expectation, was the shrouded head of a seagull with a dark, grainy material wrapped over its head. This, in turn, was faced back towards the tapered end of the wooden construction, narrow beak protruding, body encased below. It was mummified in the position of sleep. Almost as soon as I opened it, a flash of lightning from the slate-coloured clouds above lanced out, followed a split second later by a loud crack of thunder that bounced off the walls of the little garden where I stood. It struck with me like an omen then. How strange to think of it now, perhaps because it set in motion a chain of events that brought me to this place. Work at the house continued on. I never did get closer to the woman, but I began to listen to the radio channel she suggested, and soon it was habitual to switch it on when I awoke, and then to listen all day, all through my years in university, all through my life fading away in a home office or driving on business, pretending to care about selling widgets. That radio station broadened my mind and widened my horizons. It was reliable in a way so few things were. I mean, even the April showers now come in May. It was this habit, taking this daily ethereal journey, that would save my family, for I began to really pay attention to the trends, signs that lined up to an incontrovertible picture despite the positive narrative, the false trails set by those in power. Civil society in England and the world over had created its own road to apocalypse. It did it through economic and social structures that put living well now ahead of any concerns for future generations. As we paid lip service to change, we were sleepwalking towards the collapse of civilization day by day, unable to overcome our irrational behaviours and the self-destruction our death march of modernity demanded. There would be no zombies, just people without rules. But what could I do about it? A chorus of warning, pleading voices was already being ignored, no matter how loud it grew, for wise sentiments fell on the deaf ears of a population living in the moment, tied up in the daily struggle. This wasn't going to change. There was no point in me joining in with the noise. I was not the sort to simply bury my head in the sand and hope I was wrong. More practical responses were needed. We were storing up trouble for the future. I had been there for the good times. Now I would see the very bad. Hatred and isolationism simmered below a barely holding crust of civility. Politics served extremes ever more so, as the resources we all demanded for our own gross consumption were stretched more tightly under the strain of the burgeoning population. Only the stars and our place in the solar system remained as they had before. All else was conflict, aversion, angst and mob rule by social media, whether it was given between parts of society or between nation states. The human catastrophe was so evidently beginning to spring that its unsettling signs oozed like the blood from a slow healing cut, never stemming, yet never too much to warrant abject panic or meaningful measures being adopted by the state. Concerned by what I observed, I began to think through what might be needed to survive if, perhaps when, the system failed. Law and order ended and basic supplies stopped flowing. Would using our land to grow food be enough? I thought not. Thinking through scenarios, it would demand defence against theft. As a matter of survival, that would demand hostility, for hungry people wouldn't let our crops grow just to feed us. After much deliberation, I came to the conclusion that the only solution would be self-sufficiency, started after the population thinned out through the inevitable famine and conflict that would surely come. I believe that by attrition, equilibrium would eventually be reached between the population and the natural resources on offer. I suppose that our country would support 10 million and needed a way to secure our place amongst them. How long would it take for a population of 65 million people to be cut to 10? There would be no relief aid from other countries. They would also be fighting to survive. So I figured it might take just a year to starve the land of its natural resources and empty the stockpiles of preserved supplies, and a year to obliterate the weak and the unarmed or unconnected as fighting ensued over what was left. Nothing could be certain, but the state certainly wouldn't be able to guarantee everyone a future. There was only one thing that was guaranteed: factions, armed and willing to kill to advance their interests. And this I already observed with sad affirmation of foresight, as the rise of the far right and of radical Islam, the increased bravado of both rhetoric and deed, and the setting of isolationist and pessimistic opinions. From all that was happening, it was clear that my idle deliberations must now come to something, that I must act while the opportunity was still there to do so. A boat of some kind seemed like the answer, as taking to the water would greatly reduce the numbers that could reach us and take from us what we needed for ourselves. I often pondered the details as I drove the long roads across my sales territory. How long would we be able to stay aboard without returning to land? What would we need to survive? I mused as I sat in a hotel hot tub on a night away. It would depend on our ability to repel the attacks we could not avoid through sheer stealth on open water, and on our resourcefulness and preparation. I believe that, even if we were well prepared, we couldn't possibly stay at sea for more than a year, half of the time it might take us for the new order to settle on land. We would eventually need to return. This meant thinking about how we could travel safely and what we would be travelling to. We'd need to provide ourselves with a future in the new status quo. Such thoughts filled my head. I expect the stranger sat opposite me in the tub assumed I was thinking of something else as I stared down at the maelstrom between us, in which her body stretched. Often, when the practicalities of preparing got too much, like everyone else, I was tempted to pretend that the great changes wouldn't actually happen, but that it is just the ostrich approach, burying a head in denial of the evidence abounding. If it looks like shit and smells like shit, it probably is shit, and things were getting very shit. Food items began to become impossible to find, fuel was costing a much higher proportion of our income, and house prices crashed as more and more people defaulted on mortgages. I had to do something, and to secure agreement from Helen, who believed that living for the present was essential for happiness. I began to act on my instincts by obtaining items I thought would also be useful in our current life as well as what I believed would come. Not only kit, but a library of knowledge, since there would be no internet to search for information. Printed materials were needed. It was while assembling this one night in our new home that Helen began to quiz me. She was calm, but her tone could not hide a note of exasperation with me. "So you want to do what with the cellar?" She was as incredulous as she was perplexed. "I want to hide it," I replied, annoyed and not quite appreciating how odd this must sound. "Why?" she asked. She had a way of saying things that said a whole load more between the lines. "We haven't been on holiday for 2 years and you want to spend money hiding something that no one can see. What for? Why are you being so cautious?" "Because," I shrugged my shoulders. I didn't have an answer that didn't make me sound like the crazy ramblings of a prepper. "And what did you mention the other day about keeping all our food down there?" "Oh, I didn't mean all of it. I just meant dry food and a few other—" I shrugged as she cut in. "But don't you think I have enough to do without traipsing down into a damp cellar to get food? Honestly, I get no help from you, just stupid complications." I could feel my heckles rising. This conversation was going the way of too many before it. To my mind, she was in the way of essential work, not pulling with me. "Okay," I replied, trying to stay calm despite the tension that two hot-headed people can bring out in each other. "Just do what you like. I'll keep some stuff down there and replenish the kitchen larder from the cellar, and replenish the cellar whenever we go shopping. We can make it work." "We," she snorted, with a barely concealed derision. "Chance would be a fine thing. When is the last time you did any shopping?" "When was the last time I had a chance?" I snapped back. Fair comments both. She backed down a little now, as did I. We both knew what was next. A few days of silent distance between us. Now was the time for the final cuts. "Honestly, I've explained why we need to do this. Are you just going to wait until it hits us before you get on board?" My words were a criticism of her obstinate refusal to see things my way. "There won't be enough room for food down there with with what all that stuff you've been ordering recently, she deflected. I mean, I'm glad your mini projects make you happy, but what the hell do we need a hydroelectric turbine for? Is it something to do with work? I lied in the affirmative. It was easier than trying to explain. Helen and I were not on the same page. We hadn't been for a long time, if ever. Both of us cared enough to stick it out in the hope of better times and for the sake of our kids, but neither of us was happy. Compromise was something we were still working on when we weren't in open conflict or silent around each other, and my left field purchases weren't helping, especially when I complained about her wasting money on things that in hindsight was small beer. It didn't help my cause that everything the government and the news broadcasters, the city papers and the politicians said contradicted my protestations. The absence of evidence for my standpoint against popular opinion simply drove a wedge deeper and deeper between us. To her, I was an obsessed prepper, and I was throwing away our future to entertain a paranoid delusion. Not wishing to argue again, I returned to my file of Georgian farming techniques scooped from the internet into documents on my computer, and hoped she would be in a more agreeable mood when the solar panels turned up tomorrow. After all, I'd not discussed them either. I guess she had a right to complain, but I didn't see it that way back then. As massive as they were to us, our problems were a microcosm of a bigger picture. Social discourse was now no longer wisely conducted or measured either. Everything was black and white to commentators and spokespeople. Nuances, shades of grey, no longer seemed to be of interest. The truth belonged to those who could outshout the rest, to those who were permanently poised to take offence at the actions or words of others, or so it seemed to me. In this atmosphere, you can imagine the reaction I got when, on Rose's second birthday, I suggested to Helen that we buy an old Dutch barge that I had come across while visiting a client's boatyard. For many weeks after the panels arrived, the two of us had skirted around each other, barely a gentle word shared. We became more and more isolated by the attrition of her boredom and our miscommunication. The barge suggestion seemed to be a step too far for Helen, but I was unwilling to back down, convinced as I was of its vital purpose. A row ensued and turned to recriminations that were, in turn, followed by days spent in silence, save for the vain attempt to act normally around our little girl. Tension filled the air, divorce filled my angry mind, and nothing filled the widening gap between our backs in our bed at night. Too often I lay awake, wondering how long we could go on like this. After 5 days, I broached the subject again, trying to sell it as a chance for a break from the mundane. In the end, she capitulated, agreeing to buy the wreck on my less than healthy salary, but only if we spent more time and money living in the moment too. This was to be my last purchase. No more. Life was for living, she insisted. As a bored and isolated stay-at-home mum who was sick of treading water in the limited parameters of our home, the trade-off was worth it for her. Treats from the shops, cinema trips and afternoons spent in coffee shops cheered her up no end. It was an indication, too, of just how fortunate I was to have someone so easily satisfied, though I didn't appreciate that at the time. Instead, I smouldered. I was earning the money. Why did I have to justify anything? What I bought could be resold. It was an investment. What she wanted seemed to me to be momentary, fleeting and wasteful. What I didn't realise until later was just how hard she was working too, and that for her, grown-up experiences have more value than material possessions. In hindsight, who was I to judge? It was too easy to let my own beliefs dominate my opinions without really understanding her perspective, but it wasn't intelligent. If everyone else in the world had realised this and walked a mile in each other's shoes, society might still be in a good shape. Lines drawn, and by converting our small nest egg to a grinding remortgage on the house, we took possession of the rusting hulk. At that point, I did not tell her about all my acquisitions. It would have been too far to push our straining marriage. Yet in my gut, I believed it was necessary. So I wasted no time in preparing the vessel for its purpose. All the while, dark clouds loomed over more ominously on the horizon. Having fitted her out and stocked her in time, I painted the whole boat a warship pattern of seascape colours. The man that serviced the engine for me raised an eyebrow as I covered its traditional reds and browns. You won't be able to sell her if you paint it all like that, he offered, as he smoked a roll-up. I've bigger plans for this, I replied, smiling, but thanks anyway. My family did not approve of the look either. I stuck to my guns. With new horizons and adventures finally at hand to satisfy Helen, she and I experienced a brief détente, but all too soon the universal truth reasserted itself, that what you pack when you leave one place in your life is what you unpack when you arrive at the next. My fight with depression over a life led as a square peg, and her own ongoing battle with the isolation and boredom that still dominated the majority of her days, had wrought deep scars and damaging habits upon us that needed a revolutionary sea change to heal them. Not just a few trips out, a sea change that eventually came.